What happens when the person you accuse of lying already knows how your story ends? The red and blue lights painted the street in restless flashes as Officer Daniel Brooks stepped forward, his boots firm against the pavement, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the crowd. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stop right there." And the woman he was calling out, Ava Carter, did exactly that. She stopped, slowly turning to face him, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, like the chaos around her hadn't reached her at all, like she was standing in a different reality. Entirely, one where none of this was surprising, none of this was new, and certainly none of this was out of her control. But Brooks didn't see that. All he saw was a woman who, in his mind, didn't belong, not here, not dressed the way she was, not standing with that quiet confidence that irritated him more than open defiance ever could. "We've had reports," he continued, his tone already sharpened with assumption. "And your story doesn't add up." And just like that, the line was drawn, not with evidence, not with proof, but with perception, the kind that fills in blanks before facts ever get a chance. And around them, people slowed down, some pulling out their phones, others whispering just loud enough to be heard, the air tightening with that familiar tension that comes when something feels off but no one steps in. Ava didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even move an inch closer or further away. She just met his gaze. Steady, composed, her silence louder than any protest, and that silence only pushed Brooks further. "I'm asking you one more time," he said, stepping closer. "Why are you really here?" But instead of answering the way he expected, instead of stumbling or explaining or trying to prove something, Ava tilted her head just slightly, her voice low, controlled, almost detached. "You might want to double-check that." And for a split second, something shifted, something almost unnoticeable, like the faintest crack in a surface that looked solid. But Brooks brushed it off with a short laugh, dismissive, confident, the kind of confidence built on years of never being questioned, never being corrected in moments like this. "Yeah," he replied, tightening his grip on the situation. "I've heard that one before." And as he reached for his radio, the crowd leaned in just a little closer, the tension pulling everyone into the moment whether they wanted it or not. Because something about the way she stood there, the way she didn't react, didn't fit the script he thought he was in, and somewhere in the distance, just beyond the flashing lights, the faint outline of dark vehicles began to appear, unnoticed, silent, approaching without urgency but with purpose, and Ava's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, not toward Brooks, but past him, as if she was already watching the next chapter unfold, the one he didn't even know he had just stepped into. Brooks lifted his radio, his expression still carrying that same unshaken confidence. The kind that had carried him through years of moments just like this, moments where questions were not meant to be answered, but enforced. "Dispatch, I need confirmation on a possible suspect," he said, his voice steady, controlled. But there was a subtle shift now, something beneath the surface that he could not quite place, like the ground under him was not as solid as it had felt seconds ago, and across from him Ava remained exactly where she was, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing even, her gaze steady but distant, as if she was no longer focused on him but on something far beyond this street. Something already in motion. The crowd around them had grown thicker, the quiet whispers turning into a low hum of speculation, people leaning in, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing, because there was something unusual about the way this was unfolding, something that did not match the usual pattern. Most people in her position would have argued, would have tried to defend themselves, would have shown fear or frustration. But she did none of that, and that absence of reaction created a tension that was harder to ignore than any outburst could have been. "You are not helping yourself by staying silent," Brooks added, lowering the radio slightly as he studied her face, searching for a crack, a sign of uncertainty, anything that would confirm the version of the story he had already decided was true. But Ava only blinked once, slow and deliberate, before speaking again, her voice calm, almost quiet enough to be missed. "I am giving you a chance," she said, and for a brief second, the words did not register the way they should have. They did not sound like a plea or a warning, they sounded like something else entirely, something measured, something intentional, and Brooks let out a short breath, shaking his head as if dismissing the thought before it could take shape. A chance for what? He replied, his tone edged with irritation now, but also something else, something closer to impatience, as if he needed this moment to resolve quickly so everything could return to the predictable order he was used to. But before she could answer, his radio crackled again, louder this time, the static sharper, the voice on the other end more urgent than before, though the words were not fully clear, only fragments cutting through, enough to pull his attention away, enough to make him turn slightly, adjusting the volume, trying to catch what was being said, and that was when he noticed it, not through the radio, not through the crowd, but through the sudden shift in the air itself, the kind of shift that does not come from noise but from presence, the low hum of engines approaching, smooth, controlled, deliberate. And one by one, people in the crowd began to look past him, their whispers fading, their attention redirecting, the energy changing in a way that could not be explained by coincidence. Brooks followed their gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned his head just enough to see the line of dark vehicles pulling up along the curb, their movement precise, their timing exact, and for the first time since this interaction began, something in his expression faltered, not fully. Not enough for anyone to call it doubt, but enough to break the rhythm he had been operating in, and behind him, Ava exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, as if this was not an interruption, not an escalation, but the exact moment she had been waiting for all along. The engines idled with a quiet authority that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway, and as the first door of the black SUV opened, the entire rhythm of the street shifted in a way no one could ignore. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, phones slowly lowered, even the flashing lights from the patrol car seemed to lose their urgency against the calm precision of what was unfolding. Brooks straightened instinctively, his shoulders tightening as he watched a man in a dark suit step out, followed by another, then another, each one moving with the same controlled purpose, their eyes scanning the scene not with curiosity but with recognition, as if they already knew exactly what they were walking into. And for the first time Brooks did not speak, he did not reach for his radio, he simply stood there, caught in a moment that was no longer his to control. "What is this?" he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else, but no one answered him, not the crowd, not the officers nearby, because their attention had already shifted to the woman he had been questioning. Ava had not moved, not even a step, but something about her presence now felt different, not because she had changed, but because everything around her had. The men approaching stopped a few feet away, their posture respectful, deliberate, one of them nodding slightly as his gaze met hers. A silent acknowledgement that carried more weight than any introduction could have, and in that quiet exchange the balance of the entire situation tilted. Brooks felt it before he understood it, that subtle but undeniable shift where authority begins to slip, where certainty starts to fracture. "Ma'am," one of the suited agents said, his voice calm but clear, addressing Ava directly, not Brooks, not the scene, just her, and that single word seemed to echo louder than anything that had been said before. Brooks blinked, his mind racing to catch up, to reframe what he was seeing into something that made sense, but nothing fit, not the vehicles, not the agents, not the way they were looking at her. "Hold on," he said quickly, stepping forward, trying to reclaim the moment. "This is an active situation." But his words landed differently now, lighter, almost hollow, because no one reacted the way they had seconds ago, no one paused, no one deferred. Instead, the agent closest to Ava reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a badge, holding it just long enough for Brooks to see the seal, the lettering, the unmistakable authority behind it, and in that instant the air seemed to thin. Like everything that had felt certain just seconds ago was being quietly rewritten. Brooks stared at the badge, then at Ava, then back again, his thoughts colliding, rearranging, trying to catch up to a reality that had moved ahead without him. And Ava finally shifted, just a small movement, a step forward, her posture unchanged but her presence undeniable now, her voice steady, calm, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "Officer," she said, meeting his eyes with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. "You were saying something about the truth." And for the first time since this began, Brooks did not have an answer, because the story he thought he was telling had just been taken out of his hands, and whatever came next was no longer his to decide. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, not because something loud had happened, but because something undeniable had just taken its place. Brooks felt it in the silence, in the way no one rushed to fill it, in the way the crowd no longer looked at him for answers, but at her, and Ava stood there with the same calm she had carried from the beginning, except now it no longer looked like patience, it looked like control, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is already understood. "I asked you a question," Brooks said, his voice attempting to regain its earlier edge, but it came out thinner, less certain, like it was reaching for ground that was no longer there. Ava did not raise her voice, she did not step closer, she simply let the silence stretch for a second longer before speaking. "And I answered you," she said, her tone even, measured. "You just did not recognize it." And that was the moment the realization began to take shape, not fully, not all at once, but enough to unsettle everything he thought he knew about the situation. One of the agents stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, not forcefully, just enough to make it clear where the line now stood. "Officer Brooks," he said, reading the name from the badge without hesitation, his voice calm but firm. "This situation is now under federal review." The words were simple, but they carried weight, the kind that does not need explanation because it is already backed by something larger, something structured, something that does not bend to individual interpretation. Brooks blinked, his jaw tightening as he processed the statement. "Federal review," he repeated, almost reflexively, as if saying it out loud would make it easier to understand, but it did not, because nothing about this moment aligned with the version of reality he had stepped into just minutes ago. "On what grounds?" he added quickly, grasping for clarity, for authority, for anything that would place him back in control. And that was when Ava moved again, not abruptly, not dramatically, just one step forward, her presence shifting from passive to active with a precision that mirrored everything about her. "On the grounds that you initiated an action without confirming the full scope of the situation," she said, her eyes steady on his. "And you did so based on an assumption you never verified." Her words were not emotional, they were not accusatory, they were factual, each one placed carefully, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Brooks opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out at first, because for the first time he was not responding to a situation he controlled, he was responding to one that had already been defined, already been documented, already been seen from angles he had not considered, and around them the crowd remained still, no longer whispering, no longer speculating, just watching as the shift completed itself, the invisible line of authority moving from one side to the other without force, without resistance, just inevitability. Ava held his gaze for one more second before speaking again, her voice quieter now, but somehow even more direct. "You said I was lying?" She reminded him, and there was no anger in it, no frustration, just a statement of fact. But the truth does not need to prove itself to be real. And in that moment Brooks understood something he had not seen before, that this was never about proving her wrong or right, it was about the fact that she had never been on trial to begin with, and everything that followed from here would not be a reaction, it would be a consequence. The word consequence did not land all at once. It settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place, and Brooks felt it before he could fully process it, in the way his surroundings no longer responded to him the same way, in the way the space he had been commanding just minutes ago now seemed to move without him, around him, beyond him. "This does not make sense," he said, his voice lower now, not as sharp, not as certain, his eyes moving from Ava to the agents and back again, searching for something familiar, something he could still hold on to, but there was nothing, no reaction that fit the script he had been following, no resistance he could push against, only structure, calm, and a level of control that did not need to prove itself. One of the agents stepped slightly to the side, speaking quietly into an earpiece, his posture relaxed but precise, while another remained focused on Ava, awaiting her direction, not his. And that detail did not go unnoticed, not by the crowd, not by the officers standing further back, and certainly not by Brooks, because that was when the final piece clicked into place. Authority was not where he thought it was, it had shifted, and he had been the last to see it. Ava took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the moment unmistakably clear, her presence steady, her expression unchanged, but her voice carried a new weight now, not louder, not harsher, just undeniable. "You were responding to a report," she said, not as a question, but as a reconstruction. "But you never stopped to verify the source, the timing, or the context." Each word placed with precision, each one building on the last. "And in doing so, you turned a routine situation into a public accusation." Brooks opened his mouth again, his instincts pushing him to respond, to explain, to justify. "I was doing my job," he said quickly, the words coming out faster than before, like he was trying to catch up to something that had already moved past him. Ava did not interrupt him, did not challenge him directly, she simply let the statement settle before answering. "Doing your job requires judgment," she replied, her tone even, not assumption. And that distinction hung in the air longer than anything else had, because it was not just about what had happened, it was about how it had happened, and why. The crowd remained silent now, not out of uncertainty, but because the answer was becoming clear without anyone needing to say it out loud. Brooks shifted his stance slightly, the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. "So what happens now?" he asked, and for the first time, it was not a challenge, it was a question, real, direct, unguarded. Ava held his gaze, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something steadier, something more final. "No," she said calmly. "The situation is reviewed the way it should have been from the beginning." One of the agents stepped forward at that, holding a small device, its screen already active, already recording, and Brooks glanced at it, then back at Ava, understanding forming not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, unavoidable realization. This moment was not ending, it was being documented, every word, every decision, every assumption, all of it becoming part of something larger than this street, larger than this night, and Ava stepped back slightly, returning to the same calm position she had held from the start, as if the center of gravity had never truly left her. "You thought this was about catching someone in a lie," she said quietly. "But it was about seeing who would tell the truth when it mattered." And in that moment, Brooks understood that this was never a confrontation he could win. Because it was never designed that way, it was designed to reveal exactly what had just happened, and nothing more was needed for the outcome to follow. The quiet hum of the recording device filled the space where tension had once lived, not loud enough to dominate the moment but steady enough to remind everyone that nothing here would simply disappear. Brooks stared at it for a second longer than necessary, as if hoping it would somehow turn off on its own, as if this could still be undone. But the screen remained lit, capturing everything without emotion, without bias, just truth, and that was what made it different, not louder, not stronger, just undeniable. "You are documenting this," he said. His voice lower now, more controlled, but no longer in command. One of the agents nodded slightly, not as confirmation for him, but as part of a process already in motion. "Standard procedure," the agent replied, calm and precise, and those two words carried a weight that Brooks could not ignore, because they meant this was not personal, it was not reactive, it was structured, planned, inevitable. Ava remained still, her eyes steady, watching not just Brooks but the entire scene as it settled into its new shape, the flashing lights, the silent crowd, the officers at a distance who now seemed unsure where they stood in all of this. Everything had shifted, and there was no clear way back. "I followed protocol," Brooks said after a moment, the words coming slower now, more deliberate, like he was choosing them carefully, trying to rebuild something that had already been dismantled. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the statement to exist on its own before answering. "Protocol begins with observation," she said, her voice even, "not conclusion." And once again, it was not the volume of her words that mattered, it was the precision, the way each sentence removed another layer of certainty he had relied on. Brooks exhaled quietly, his gaze dropping for a brief second before returning to her. "So what you are saying is that I was wrong?" he asked, but there was something different in the way he said it, not defensive, not confrontational, just direct, and Ava held his gaze, not with judgment, but with clarity. "I am saying that you acted before you understood." she replied, and that distinction settled deeper than anything else had. Because it was not about labeling him, it was about defining the moment, and in doing so, it left very little room for interpretation. The agent with the device adjusted it slightly, ensuring the angle remained clear, capturing Brooks, Ava, the scene, the context, every detail that had led to this point, and the presence of that device made something else clear as well. This was not ending here, this was beginning somewhere else. Somewhere larger, somewhere structured. Brooks looked around. Briefly, noticing how the crowd had shifted, no longer leaning in with curiosity, but watching with a kind of quiet understanding, as if the story they thought they were witnessing had revealed something deeper than they expected, something about authority, about assumption, about how quickly one can replace the other. "What happens to this?" Brooks asked, nodding slightly toward the device, and this time it was not Ava who answered, but the agent standing beside her. "It becomes part of the record," he said simply, and that answer carried no emotion, no emphasis, just fact, and Ava finally took a small step back, returning once again to the position she had held from the start, composed, steady, unchanged, as if everything that had unfolded had only confirmed what she already knew. "The truth does not need to be loud," she said quietly, her eyes still on Brooks. "It only needs to be seen." And in that moment, with the lights still flashing and the street now completely silent, it became clear that what had happened here would not fade, it would follow, it would be reviewed, and more importantly, it would be understood in a way that no assumption ever could. The flashing lights still painted the street in restless colors, but something deeper had settled underneath them now, something quieter, heavier. Like the moment had shifted from confrontation to reflection, Brooks stood there without speaking. His shoulders no longer squared with certainty but held in a stillness that suggested something else was taking place inside him, something slower, something harder to ignore, and around him the world continued to adjust. Officers who had once stood back now exchanged glances. Instead of stepping forward, the crowd no longer whispered with curiosity but watched with a kind of quiet awareness, as if they were witnessing not just an event but a lesson unfolding in real time. Ava remained exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but there was no tension in her now, no need for it, because everything that needed to surface already had. And the agents around her moved with calm precision, one reviewing the recording, another speaking softly into his earpiece, coordinating details that extended far beyond this street, far beyond this moment. "Is this how it always works?" Brooks asked finally, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as if the question had been forming long before he spoke it. Ava looked at him for a second, not surprised by the question, not dismissive of it either, just present. "Only when someone assumes they already know the answer," she replied, and there was no judgment in her tone, only clarity, the kind that does not push but simply reveals. Brooks nodded slightly, the movement small but meaningful, his gaze drifting briefly toward the recording device, then back to her. "I did not think it would go this far," he admitted, and the words hung in the air longer than expected, not because they were loud, but because they were honest in a way nothing else had been up to this point. Ava did not respond right away, she let the silence carry the weight of that admission before speaking. "It rarely starts that way," she said, her voice calm. "But it always depends on what happens next." And that was where the moment shifted again, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, where decisions are made before they are seen. Brooks exhaled slowly, his posture easing just slightly, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in recognition, as if something he had held onto without realizing was finally being released. "And what happens next?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a defense, but as a genuine question, one that did not seek control but understanding. Ava met his gaze, steady as before, but there was something else there now, something quieter, something that felt less like distance and more like direction. "That depends on whether you choose to see this as a mistake or as a moment," she said, and those words settled deeper than anything that had come before, because they did not define him, they gave him a choice, and in that choice, there was something rare, something that did not come from authority or position, but from awareness. The agents continued their work without interruption, the scene now operating with a quiet efficiency that no longer needed attention, and the crowd began to thin slowly, people stepping away not because they had lost interest, but because they understood that what mattered here was no longer visible in the same way. It had moved inward, into the space where perspective changes and consequences take root. Brooks stood there for another moment, taking it all in, the lights, the silence, the presence of something larger than himself, and Ava finally turned slightly, her focus shifting beyond him, beyond the street, toward whatever came next. Because for her, this moment had already served its purpose, and what remained was not the conflict, but the truth it had uncovered. The street began to breathe again, slowly, cautiously, as if the moment that had just unfolded needed time to settle into something real. The flashing lights still turned, but they no longer felt urgent, they felt distant, like a reminder of what had been rather than what still was. Brooks remained where he stood, but his focus had shifted inward, his eyes no longer scanning for control or reaction, but reflecting something quieter, something that had replaced the certainty he once carried. And Ava, now slightly turned away from him, was already moving forward in a way that did not require motion, her attention shifting to the agents beside her, to the process that had quietly taken over the scene. One of them stepped closer, speaking in a low, respectful tone. "Everything is secured," he said, and she gave a small nod, not as confirmation for him, but as acknowledgement of a system that was already complete, a system that did not rely on noise or force, only precision. Brooks watched this exchange carefully, noticing how effortlessly it unfolded, how naturally authority flowed without being demanded, and it struck him then, not as a sudden realization, but as something that had been building since the beginning, that power did not always look the way he expected it to. Sometimes it stood still, sometimes it waited, and sometimes it revealed itself only when it was too late to ignore. "You knew this would happen," he said, his voice quieter now, more certain in its uncertainty. Ava paused for a brief second before answering, her gaze not returning fully to him, but not dismissing him either. "I knew what could happen," she said, her tone steady. "The rest depended on choices." And that word lingered longer than anything else, because it pointed not to her, but to him, to every moment that had led here, every decision that had shaped the outcome. Brooks nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that truth, his shoulders no longer tense, but not relaxed either, simply present, as if he was standing in a place he had never fully understood before. "And if I had made a different choice?" he asked, not expecting to undo anything, but needing to understand what had been possible. Ava finally turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes once more, not with distance, but with clarity. "Then this would have been just another conversation," she replied, and that answer did not carry regret, it carried perspective, the kind that does not change the past but defines its meaning. Around them the agents began to move with quiet coordination, one speaking into a device, another guiding the remaining officers into position without conflict, without resistance, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to challenge. The structure had already taken hold. Brooks glanced once more at the recording device, now lowered but still active, and for the first time he did not see it as something watching him, but as something preserving the moment as it truly was, unfiltered, unchanged. And Ava took a small step forward, her attention now fully aligned with what came next, her role no longer hidden, no longer waiting, but defined. And as she moved, the agents followed without hesitation, not because they were instructed, but because they already understood. And Brooks remained behind, not abandoned, not dismissed, but left with something far more difficult to confront, the understanding that this moment was not just about what had happened, but about what it revealed. And as the vehicles began to pull away, as the crowd thinned and the street returned to its quiet rhythm, one truth stayed behind, clear and unmoving: that the line between authority and accountability is not drawn by position, but by the choices made. When no one is expected to question them, the last of the vehicles disappeared down the street without urgency, their presence fading as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a stillness that felt different from before, not empty, but settled, as if something important had taken place and the space itself was adjusting to it. Brooks stood alone now near the edge of the sidewalk. The flashing lights from his patrol car reflecting faintly against the pavement, no longer commanding attention. Just existing, and for the first time since the night began, there was no one looking at him, no crowd waiting, no voice calling for action, only the quiet weight of what had already happened. He looked down briefly at his hands, then back toward the direction the vehicles had gone, as if trying to follow something that could not be seen anymore, something that had already moved beyond this moment, and in that silence, his thoughts began to arrange themselves differently, not around what he had done, but around why he had done it, and that question did not come with an easy answer. It came with layers, with assumptions he had never needed to examine before, with patterns that had always felt normal until they were suddenly not. It was routine, he said quietly to himself, the words sounding different now, less certain, more reflective, as if repeating them might reveal something he had missed. But the more he thought about it, the less it felt routine, because routine does not create moments like this. Routine does not shift the ground beneath you. Routine does not stay with you after everything else has moved on. He turned slightly, glancing at the patrol car, the radio still faintly active, the lights still rotating, but even that familiar presence felt distant now, like something he understood before but could not quite return to in the same way. And across the street, a few people lingered for a moment longer before continuing on, their conversations quieter, their expressions thoughtful, as if they too were carrying something away from this, something that extended beyond what they had seen. Brooks took a slow breath, the air cooler now, calmer, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape the scene, but to face it more clearly, because without the noise, without the urgency, what remained was simple, direct, undeniable, a series of choices, each one leading to the next, each one building toward a moment he had not expected, and now could not ignore. He opened his eyes again and looked down the street, not searching for the agents, not expecting anything more to happen, but understanding that what had already happened was enough to change how he saw the role he carried, enough to question the certainty he had relied on, enough to recognize that authority without awareness is not control, it is risk. And as he stood there, the last of the lights reflecting softly around him, one thought settled more clearly than the rest, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, that the next time a moment like this came, and it would, the difference would not be in the situation. It would be in the choice he made before it unfolded, because now, for the first time, he understood that the truth does not arrive at the end of a situation, it is present from the beginning, waiting to be recognized by those willing to see it. The street had almost returned to normal, but for Brooks nothing felt the same. The quiet now carried weight instead of calm, and every small detail seemed sharper than before, the hum of the patrol car, the faint echo of distant traffic. Even the rhythm of his own breath felt more deliberate, more noticeable, as if the moment had slowed everything down just enough for him to finally see what he had missed all along. He walked slowly toward his car, not with urgency, not with purpose, just movement, the kind that gives space for thought to settle, and as he reached the door, his hand paused on the handle, not because he did not know what to do next, but because he knew that whatever came next would not be the same as before. He glanced at his reflection in the window, the uniform still the same, the badge still in place, but something behind it had shifted, something that could not be seen from the outside, something that would not go back to what it was. "It is not about the badge," he said quietly, the words forming without effort now, as if they had been waiting for this moment, and he let out a slow breath, opening the door but not getting in, instead standing there, looking down the empty stretch of road where everything had unfolded, replaying the sequence not as a defense, not as an excuse, but as a series of decisions, each one clearer now than it had been in the moment. Each one showing him something he had not been willing to question before, and that was when it became undeniable. The situation had not escalated because of what he saw, it escalated because of what he assumed, and that difference, small as it once felt, now carried more weight than anything else. He stepped back from the car slightly, closing the door without entering, choosing instead to remain where he was, present, aware, and for the first time, willing to sit with the discomfort of that realization. Because it was not something that could be dismissed, it was something that had to be understood. The radio crackled faintly again, another call, another situation waiting somewhere else. But he did not reach for it immediately, he let it sit there for a second longer, recognizing that the next call would not just be another routine moment, it would be a test, not of authority, but of awareness. And that shift changed everything. He reached for the radio slowly this time, his voice steady but different, less reactive, more deliberate, acknowledging the call with a clarity that had not been there before, and as he spoke, there was no rush, no urgency to prove control, only a quiet commitment to approach what came next with a perspective he did not have before, and somewhere beyond the street, beyond the fading echoes of what had just happened, Ava continued forward with the same calm certainty she had carried from the beginning, her role already moving into the next phase, the next layer, because for her, this had never been about one moment, it had always been about the pattern behind it, the choices that revealed more than actions ever could, and as the distance between them grew, not just physically but in purpose, one truth remained steady, unspoken but clear, that power is not defined by the moment you take control, but by the moment you choose to understand it, and that choice, once seen, cannot be unseen, no matter where the road leads next. The engine of the patrol car came to life with a low steady hum, but Brooks did not pull away right away, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as he looked out through the windshield. The empty street stretching ahead of him like a quiet reminder of everything that had just unfolded, the call on the radio still echoing faintly in his mind, waiting, expecting a response that used to come without hesitation, but now carried a different weight, a different meaning. He adjusted his grip slightly, not out of nerves, but out of awareness, the kind that makes even familiar actions feel intentional, measured, and for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about how quickly he could respond, but how clearly he could understand what he was responding to. He pressed the accelerator gently, the car rolling forward at a controlled pace, not rushing, not chasing, just moving with purpose, and as the city lights passed by, reflections shifting across the windshield, his thoughts followed a similar rhythm, steady, focused, revisiting the moment not as something to correct, but as something to carry forward, something that would shape every decision that came after. The voice on the radio repeated the call, slightly sharper this time, and Brooks responded calmly, his tone even, his words deliberate, asking for details, clarifying information, something he might have overlooked before, something that now felt essential, because he understood that the difference between action and reaction begins long before the moment itself. It begins in the questions you choose to ask, the pause you allow yourself to take, the space you create to see beyond the surface. And as he listened, really listened this time, he noticed things he might have ignored before, small inconsistencies, gaps that needed context, details that required patience instead of assumption. And instead of filling those gaps with certainty, he let them remain. Choosing to understand rather than conclude, the road ahead opened up, traffic thinning as he moved through the city, each mile marking not just distance, but change, subtle but real, and somewhere beyond the streets, in a quiet office far removed from flashing lights and public attention, Ava stood before a wall of screens, each one displaying fragments of different cases, different moments, all connected by patterns that were not always obvious to those inside them. One of the agents approached her, holding a tablet. The same recording now processed, catalogued, ready to be reviewed as part of something larger. "It is all there," he said, and Ava nodded slightly, her eyes scanning the screen, not looking for confirmation, but for context, because this was never about one officer, one moment, one mistake. It was about understanding the system that allowed those moments to happen, and ensuring that when they did, they were seen clearly, without distortion, without delay. She turned away from the screen after a moment, her expression calm, unchanged, but her focus already shifting to what came next, because the work did not end with exposure, it began there. And back on the road, Brooks continued forward, unaware of the full scope of what had been set in motion, but fully aware that something within him had changed, something that would not allow him to return to the way things were. Because once you see the difference between assumption and truth, you do not forget it, you carry it. And whether it guides you or challenges you depends entirely on the choices you make when the next moment arrives. The city lights stretched endlessly ahead as Brooks continued down the road. But his focus was no longer on the destination, it was on the process, the way each Detail now demanded attention instead of assumption. The call he was responding to unfolded differently than any before, not because the situation itself was unique, but because he was. The voice on the radio provided updates, fragments of information that once would have been enough for him to act. But now he listened more carefully, asking for clarification, repeating details, making sure nothing was left undefined. And that small shift changed everything. When he arrived at the scene, he did not step out with immediate authority. He paused, observing, letting the moment reveal itself before he moved into it, and that pause, just a few seconds longer than usual, created space to see, space to understand, space to avoid repeating what had already been exposed. The people in front of him looked at him the same way they always had, expecting direction, expecting control. But this time his presence felt different, quieter, more grounded, not because he had less authority, but because he was no longer trying to prove it. He approached slowly, his voice calm, his questions direct but open, and as the situation unfolded, he noticed something he might have missed before. The story was not as simple as it first appeared. There were layers, perspectives, details that required patience instead of speed, and instead of forcing a conclusion, he allowed those layers to surface, guiding the moment instead of dominating it, and for the first time, the resolution came without tension, without escalation, just clarity. And as he stepped back, the realization settled deeper than before. This was what it was supposed to look like, not control, but understanding, not reaction, but awareness. Miles away, Ava stood once again in front of the screens, the earlier recording now part of a larger archive, connected to other cases, other moments, forming patterns that revealed more than any single event ever could. One of the analysts pointed to a sequence on the screen, highlighting similarities, behaviors repeated across different locations, different officers, different circumstances, and Ava watched closely, her expression focused, because this was the real work, not the confrontation, not the reveal, but the understanding of what lay beneath it, the system, the habits, the assumptions that shaped outcomes before anyone even realized it. It is consistent, the analyst said, and Ava nodded slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the data, not surprised, but confirmed, because patterns do not appear by accident, they form through repetition, through decisions made without reflection, and once they are seen, they cannot be ignored. She stepped closer to the screen, her voice calm but decisive. Then we do not treat it as isolated, she said, and those words carried direction, purpose, the beginning of something that extended far beyond one street, one officer, one moment. Back on the road, Brooks sat in his car for a second after the call had ended, his hands resting lightly on the wheel again. But this time the silence felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but clear, as if something had aligned, not perfectly, but enough to move forward with intention. And as he pulled away, merging back into the steady flow of the city, one truth remained with him, steady and unshaken, that the difference between repeating a mistake and changing it is not found in the moment itself, but in the awareness you bring into it, and that awareness, once gained, becomes the only real measure of what you do next. The city moved forward the way it always did, steady, indifferent, carrying thousands of stories at once. But for those who had been part of that moment, something had shifted in a way that would not simply fade with time. Brooks drove through the familiar streets with a different kind of focus now, not searching for problems to solve, but for context to understand, and with every passing block, every interaction, every quiet observation, the lesson from that night settled deeper, no longer something he had to think about, but something that began to shape how he saw everything around him. The badge on his chest no longer felt like a symbol of control, but a responsibility to see clearly, to act with intention, to pause when necessary, and that pause, once ignored, had become his most powerful tool, not because it slowed him down, but because it grounded him in truth before action. And miles away, inside a quiet operations room where screens still glowed with fragments of captured moments, Ava stood watching the patterns continue to unfold, each case adding another layer to a system that was finally being seen for what it was, not through emotion, not through assumption, but through evidence, consistency, and clarity. One of the analysts approached again, pointing to a newly flagged sequence, another situation beginning to mirror the one from before, and Ava studied it carefully, her expression unchanged, her focus unwavering, because this was not about stopping one moment, it was about changing what those moments revealed over time. It repeats, the analyst said quietly, and Ava nodded once, her voice calm but resolute. Then we keep watching until it changes. And that was the difference, not force, not reaction, but persistence, the kind that reshapes outcomes without needing to announce itself. Back on the road, Brooks pulled to a stop at a red light, the glow reflecting across the windshield as he looked ahead, not at the intersection, but at the path in front of him, and for the first time, he understood that the most important moments in his role would not be the loud ones, not the ones filled with urgency or pressure, but the quiet ones, the seconds before a decision is made. The space where assumption can either take over or be replaced by awareness, and as the light turned green, he moved forward without hesitation, not because he had all the answers, but because he had learned to ask the right questions, and somewhere between those two paths, something fundamental had changed, not just in what he did, but in how he chose to do it, and as the city continued to move around him, unchanged on the surface, one truth remained beneath it all, steady and unshaken, that authority can control a moment. But only awareness can transform it, and on that night, without force, without resistance, without a single raised voice, the definition of power had quietly changed its shape, leaving behind a lesson that would echo far beyond the street where it began, a lesson that did not need to be spoken to be understood, because those who had seen it would carry it forward, and those who had not would eventually face it in their own moment of truth, because in the end, the law is not defined by who enforces it, but by who understands it when it matters most.